Okay, so we're recording and we're ready to go. So today is all about yoga and the hips, and I'd like to thank Yoga Australia for trusting me to cover this topic, and also to everyone for jumping on board on this day of yoga, International Day of Yoga. And what's really interesting is it's also the official month for awareness of hip dysplasia. So it's quite serendipitous that they both happen together. So we will be talking a bit about that condition too. So there we go. So I recall when I first started my teacher training, we were living in a community where there were lots of yogis. And one day we met this young lady who really lamented the fact that her teacher had told her to stop walking everywhere, and she had to take an auto rickshaw. Because what she was wanting to do was get her legs behind her head. And she was working diligently hours every day, and her hips were getting sorer. They seemed to be being just as tight. And because of that, her teacher was telling her, well, you've got to stop walking because your hips are getting tight. And it kind of got me thinking, are we putting a little bit too much emphasis on flexibility, on the ability just to do an aesthetically pleasing pose, or a pose that might help our ego a little way, but then that's at the expense of being able to get from point A to point B and live a life that we want? So I've been really interested in yoga and injury because I've felt so many physical benefits, but I've also suffered yoga related injuries because of my approach to asana practice. So it's been an area of interest, and it turns out that I'm not alone. So my name's Emily Iglesias. I'm a physiotherapist and a yoga teacher. I have been a physio 13 years, and I started practicing yoga while I was at uni studying physio. And I think what I can bring to this topic is I've done extra training in an approach called Connect therapy, where we really look at how the components of the body work together. So the interrelated nature of everything. So today is an opportunity not just to review the anatomy and biomechanics, but also how we approach flexibility and perhaps our whole asana practice. So just a couple of stats about yoga and injury and the hips. So hip pain is one of the leading causes people go to their GPs, and hip pain significantly impacts quality of life. And this isn't just OA, like osteoarthritis in the hips, but gluteal tendinopathy also creates equal amounts of pain, dysfunction, inability to work and earn an income and participate in daily activities. About 20% of Australian yogis experience a yoga related injury in their lifetime, and about 2 to 4% it's in the last month. And I do feel that the concept of ahimsa, so non-violence, and being able to create a safe environment for our students really does mean that we do have to dedicate some time to learning how to physically move well. I totally believe that yoga is an 8-limbed system, and that asana practice is just 1/8 of it. But if people are getting injured in that 1/8, they're not going to necessarily get the full impact of the other 7 limbs if we've created a barrier or people have come to harm in our classes. So the key learning objectives for today is to kind of review the relevant anatomy and biomechanics, understand the theory of of some of the physical practice, so stretching, strengthening, control, flexibility, what's the physiology behind that, and exploring a little bit more deeply about hip opening. So hip opening is a common term. You search it on Google and you'll get 333 million hits. So it is a term that is out there. And for those of you who are on the call a little bit early, I got you to have a think about what hip opening means to you. So have you used the term, and what do you think of? So the kind of definition that I'm going by is that it's the process of improving the flexibility, but I'd also add the ease of movement for the hip. So then if we just go a step further, because I think this is sometimes a block to our understanding. Sorry, I'll go back, I'll hide that for a second. So if we think of being open to our yoga practice, often there's, so you think, I'm open to possibilities, I'm open to new ways of doing things. So there's a psychological term or a mindset of being open, but then you've got the physical term of open hips. So they are two different things. One's talking about a physical state and one is talking about a mental mindset. So just a question that we can think to ourselves is there a problem using the term openness if there might be a little bit of grey area or smudging so that people kind of think openness in both categories mean the same thing? So to elaborate, I have for a long time not developed these type of workshops and lectures because I can't physically do a lot of the practices that I do understand what's behind them. So that's been a mental block holding me back, thinking, well, if I can't physically do it, then maybe I don't know enough about it. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced this feeling of not feeling good enough because if you can't do it physically, then you don't feel you have as much to offer in other ways. Well, so I'm making myself very vulnerable, and I know as I say it out loud, it sounds ridiculous, but sometimes this is what's going on in the inside. The other things that I wanted to cover is it seems that, and I think the questions that have come out means that you guys are already onto this. There's almost a feeling that if my hips were more open, then I would feel better. But is being more open always the answer? And can the hips be too open? And someone asked a question about hypermobility and flexibility. So I will just give you, was it a spoiler alert? More open is not always the answer. And yes, the hips can be too open. By that, I'd mean too lack of control of the range of motion that you've got. So what I got you guys to think of before was, what are our own assumptions and beliefs about flexibility? What do we understand as, what are the key components which make us flexible or not? What helps and what hinders it? Because a little bit of self-study and examining our own beliefs can then help us work out what we're going to do about it. So if you believe that your psoas is tight, everything you do is going to be release your psoas. But maybe we need to consider other aspects of flexibility. Yeah. So I'll move on from there. So part one, I'm going to try and make it as interesting as possible, but sometimes anatomy and biomechanics can be a little bit hard, but let's see if we can keep it a bit fun and interesting. So anatomy and biomechanics, because in the hip, as in other areas of the body, form follows function, or function follows form. So the shape and the nature of a joint will determine what that joint can do. So if we look at the hip, so the hip is required for stability and locomotion, and it's a key component in the linkage of body segments required for functional movement. So we talk about a kinematic chain. So when the foot is on the floor, so you see the lady on the left, she's got her left leg on the floor as she's running. We'd call that a closed kinematic chain, because when the hip is kind of stuck between the body and the foot. And if you move one region, so if you bend the knee, then the hip has to move. It's part of a bit of a closed chain. Whereas the right leg, which is in a swing phase, the hip can swing through and be really mobile, and the hip needs both the ability to be stable and the ability to move. And the reason I've got Bruce Lee on the right there is he's got his famous 1-inch or 6-inch punch. But he recognized the importance of good load transfer all the way from his feet out to his arms. So there's so many movements in our body require the whole integrated movement, and the hip is one of them. So the hip is a ball and socket joint, and therefore it's often linked with the shoulder, because the shoulder is also a ball and socket joint. So basically it's exactly what it says. The femur side is the shape of a ball, and the pelvis side is the shape of a concave socket. But if we look at the evolution behind them, So the shoulder developed because of a high degree of mobility. So you can see the gibbon in the bottom left there for brachiation, for swinging through the trees, and then to be able to reach and grasp and feed ourselves. So they're very different joints. So therefore, if we go back, the shoulder is a very shallow joint, and its high degree of mobility, whereas the hip requires a high degree of stability because its primary function is to propel us through space. So we talk about the hip, even though it's very stable, it is quite mobile because it's a ball and socket joint. It can move in, it has 3 degrees of freedom, which means that it can move about 3 different axes in 3 different planes. As opposed to, say, our elbow, that's got 1 degree of freedom. It can only flex and extend, but our hip can flex and extend. It can move across the midline of our body into adduction and abduction, and it can rotate. So it's called external and internal rotation. You might have also heard it called medial and lateral rotation. And then if you combine them all together, if you combine all 3 planes of movement, then we get circumduction. And that's when you circle if you were to draw a circle with your foot, that would be circumduction. So the key components that we kind of need to be aware of in the hip. So we've got, now, if I use the term innominate, what that refers to is the pelvis. So that this half of the pelvis is made up of the 3 bones when you're born or you're a baby, and then they fuse together. So it's the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, and they meet and form the socket. So that's the acetabulum of the pelvis. The other part of the bone is the head of the femur. So it's got an arrow there for the articular surface of the femoral head. There's then a neck, and you've got the shaft of the femur. So it's basically 2 bones, but then the other key structures are, you can see in the top left there's an arrow pointing to the labrum. So that's a wedge shape of cartilage, which runs around the whole acetabulum and makes the depth of the socket greater for increased stability. And then you've got the joint capsule, which is reinforced by really strong ligaments. In fact, I learned in my preparation for this that you can actually dislocate your hip and still stand on it, and the hip can still support 2/3 of your body weight when it is dislocated because it is so strong. It's really, in a normal functioning hip, it's really hard to dislocate. It usually takes the force of a car accident. If you were in the most, I guess, vulnerable position of the hip is if you were to cross your legs. So this is the mechanism: crossing your legs and being in the passenger side of a vehicle, and then being in a car accident so that your knees hit the dashboard. That's one of the most common mechanisms of a hip dislocation. So someone asked about hip replacements. Anyone with a hip replacement, you need to avoid that position because that's the way that the capsule is cut so that they can replace the femoral head. So think of legs crossed. Any position with a hip like that, you want to avoid in instability situations. So then I'm going to briefly just cover some of the muscles here, but we're going to cover it more later when it comes to control. So instead of thinking of having to learn individual muscles, one of the easier cheat sheet ways to do it is the thigh bone. So on the left, you can see a leg and it's been cut through the center. And if we look at this cross section of the thigh, the right side of the page is the inner thigh and the left side of the page is the outer thigh. And it's divided into 3 sections. So you've got the anterior compartment, which has the effect of flexing your hip or extending your knee. You've got the medial, and that one is innervated by the femoral nerve. Then you've got the medial compartment, which pulls the leg across your body. And that one is innervated by the obturator nerve. And then you've got the posterior compartment, which pulls your leg backwards, and that's innervated by the sciatic nerve. So you could think of them in terms of their relative area. Now, for those people who are astute, you'll see that they're in terms of the leg, the thigh, there is no lateral compartment. So abduction occurs more up higher around the hip rather than in the thigh. So this only covers some of the muscles. So we'll get into more of the muscles later. And so in terms of range of motion, so there's normative data on what we should expect the hip to be able to do. So normally it's taken from pain-free controls in the general population. So these values might be different to what you think, or they might be 5 or 10 degrees different here or there. And I think that would reflect which is the reference population. But if you took this to think, okay, an optimally functioning hip should be able to move in these directions in these amounts, then what I would propose is sometimes we get caught up in, so let's take a forward bend, for example, and we really want to be able to touch our toes, or perhaps we want to get our head closer to our kneecaps. So we could work a lot on the flexion to try and get that to happen. But, you know, if you're not getting a basic amount of function in all ranges, what's the point in making your flexion really good if you've got an optimal amount of flexion, but you can't extend your knee or you can't extend your hip? Does that kind of make sense? So instead of trying to make one aspect of flexibility really good, I think step one would be to try and get an equal amount of optimal flexibility in each range, get that controlled and strong, and then think of progressively increasing the ranges that you need. And if anyone works one-on-one with people or in a yoga therapy perspective, then perhaps you'd look more, okay, what are the jobs or the sports, or what's the needs of this individual in front of me? Are they a dancer? Do they have certain needs, which would mean that I would prioritize a certain degree of flexibility, a certain direction of flexibility, in order for them to perform what they need to. So the other thing which we'll talk about it here. So in terms of what limits your flexibility, so this came up in the questions. So there's certain passive restraints to flexibility. So the shape of the joint surface. Some people have a more shallow acetabulum than others, and they will have a more mobile hip, but one that will probably wear away quicker. Sometimes the angle of the neck of the femur, either in this direction or the amount of twist, is different between people, and that will determine the amount of turnout that you have, and also again the strength and flexibility around your hip. So ligaments, joint surface and ligaments, we call them passive restraints to flexibility. But then you've got muscles which are more of an active restraint, and the difference is that muscles will be also impacted by the position over another joint. So with the hip, there are a lot of two joint muscles that act over the hip and over the knee. So the position of the knee is crucial in determining how much tension or flexibility you can expect from the hip. Is that making some sense? Hopefully. So I know some of this is going to be a bit of a pretty brief and speedy overview. We're going to try and put it together later. So there's individual factors. So the angle of the neck of your femur, where your acetabulum faces. So if the ball and socket joint of your, if the ball of your acetabulum faces a little bit more forward versus a little bit more out to the side, that's going to impact, that's your individual anatomy. And I don't think that you'd know, I wouldn't be able to look at someone in a class and say, that's what it is. I would need an x-ray. Then you can draw lines and look at things. So that's what I'd say in terms of determining if it's the bone or muscles. An x-ray would probably be your gold standard to be able to work that out. But at the end of the day, you've got what you've got. So what does it matter what an x-ray says if you're just looking at optimizing function? And the other interesting thing is loading patterns. So right from birth, how your hip and pelvis is loaded in utero, and then to early childhood, and then throughout your lifespan, determines the wear and the shape of your hip. So anyone who's had a baby, especially more recently, I say more recently, yeah, the last 10 years or at least, they do infant tests for hip dysplasia. So they put the hip in its least stable position and try and basically dislocate it a little bit and see how much laxity there are in the joints. So if there is quite a degree of laxity, if you can dislocate the hip, they will then put the baby in a plaster cast and they could keep it in a cast for 6 months or so, because if they load it like that early, then you can change the shape of the acetabulum then, and you can pretty much largely normalize the shape and orientation of the acetabulum. But what's interesting is sometimes people have a mild case of dysplasia, in which case it's not picked up until people are in their 20s or 30s. And that could be a lot of our yoga population. And the problem is, by the time it gets to that stage, then the only correction is quite complicated or quite complex reconstructive surgery, or you have to wait till the hip's worn out sufficiently to require a hip replacement. So hip dysplasia, I guess my takeaway from that is unstable hips are probably more common than I realized, and it's something that I'm going to be considering more. And especially more recently, I've been working a lot more on hip strengthening postures and doing a little bit of hip opening at the end. And I feel that my clients and students are really enjoying that approach. So now we'll talk about optimal function of the hip, and I'm gonna keep it really simple, and this is how, and we might be able to do a little practical about this. So if we look at the hip from the side, you can see that dot in the center of the femoral head. That is the axis of motion. So any of those 3 degrees of freedom, you know, the flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and rotation, pretty much should happen about that axis. So if you've got uneven forces around the hip joint, instead of getting a nice spin, you'll get a translation of the femoral head in the socket. And the type of strategy that the person's using will determine what structures get sore. So as an example, if someone has a certain pattern that causes the femoral head to translate forward, the femoral head is going to rub on the labrum, and the labrum can be a source of pain. It can tear away from the acetabulum, but continued pinching and sliding. So that's the kind of pattern where people flexing their knee toward their chest and pulling it across their body, if they get a pinching at the front of their hip, that could be a sign that the labrum is being squashed by the femoral head, and they'll get their pain there. Other people, in terms of probably more the instability, if anyone's been diagnosed with piriformis syndrome or like a deep ache in the back of their hip, and dancers and gymnasts are probably more likely to get a posterior instability. That would be where the femoral head is translating back. So the takeaway message is, where you get pain around the hip will be determinant of the particular strategy the person is using in daily function. That strategy is made up of their whole lifetime, of when they were born, their early childhood activities, their work, previous injuries, you know, the old ankle sprain. So different, but I guess the one thing they have in common is that they don't have a centered axis of motion. So what we're going to go through later are different ways that we could perhaps restore and balance the axis of motion, and therefore unload whatever the structures are that are getting sore. So sometimes it might be we need to increase stability. Maybe we need to decrease some of the excessive pulls which are translating the femoral head around. And anyone who has an engineering or biomechanical focus or a physics focus might recall that if a muscle is acting further away from the joint axis, it's going to produce more rotation. A muscle that is closer to the center of motion will create more of a compression. So you can let that marinate for a little bit, and we'll come back to that later. So that's just some concepts to be going on in the background. And then if you're trying to work out, are my hips or my students' hips functioning optimally? So you can consider the translation or the femoral head being centered, but then the hip is part of a complex, the lumbo-pelvic hip control. So then we want to go a step back and go, okay, how's the hip functioning along with the pelvis and the lumbar spine? And I guess the presence and what I was talking about before is the presence and location of pain will reflect the tissues that are being affected. But no matter where the tissues are, we want to optimize the function of the hip. And if we simply think, oh, my hip's not painful, therefore it's fine, then we might be missing we're missing some of the story, because often you have a restriction in motion in one direction specifically, and then if you do that long enough, you stress the tissues and then it becomes painful. So I think there is some validity at looking at hip openness if we're thinking about ease of movement and range of motion, and we want that balanced. To me, that sounds like a hip that's functioning optimally. If a hip is not moving freely, or it's not got a balanced amount of flexibility, that could be a sign of dysfunction that you could get onto sooner and balance before it gets to pain. So hopefully that's making some sense. So people who've asked about stability, the picture on the left is the most stable position for the hip. And that's based on the biomechanics of the close packed position. So in biomechanics, that refers to the position in which there is the most joint surface contact. And that way, the joint is providing the most stability or most restriction to motion. So if you had someone who you thought had unstable hips, maybe consider, can you design a practice based around you just want to go a little bit wider with the knees there and bring the feet together slightly, but maybe you could be creative and do some postures based around that and see how creative you can do. Cow and cat, maybe some rotations. Maybe you could kneel up and do things in kneeling. Maybe you could lift the back leg and do a variation of warrior on all fours. But if you were concerned about stability, that would be my go-to position. Now, another really interesting thing about the hip is in most joints, the closed packed position will also tense the ligaments up. So you'll have passive support from the joint surfaces being in contact, and you'll wind up tensioning the ligaments so it won't move. But with a hip, it's actually a completely different position. So the back leg in warrior 1, where you've got extension, if you went a little bit wider into abduction and you kicked the heel out a little bit, that would be the position where the ligaments are under the most tension. So I would say, I don't think this is as stable. You've tensed the ligaments, but it's not as stable. In fact, in this position, I find people who have labral problems or the ligaments are irritated at the front of their hip, they'll often find this to be a really provocative position and they won't like this. So I would say the warrior position with the back leg is often one where you're at risk of overstressing the front of the capsule. And sometimes when we think we're stretching psoas or stretching the quads, we're actually tensioning the ligaments at the front. So can we approach hip extension in a way that allows us to preserve the center of motion without pushing the femoral head forward? And we will have a try at that in just a moment. So actually, I'll leave this summary up. I think that's actually a good place to go over just a little quick practical about how do we keep the femoral head centered. I can see there's a couple questions in the chat box and I'll come back to that. So I'm going to take this off. And so if you're available, if you're able to stand up and do this with me, then join in. I'll just learn and watch. I'm just going to put the volume up. So I'm going to come back here. Okay. So hopefully you can hear me. Okay, so I'm going to alternate between being up close and further away. So we want to first of all find the axis of motion for our hips. So if you find your groin crease, so you've got, when you sit down, you fold across. I shouldn't have worn black, but when you sit down, your groin, find your groin, and then halfway along. So I just don't want to go too far away from here so you can't hear. So go halfway along your groin crease, right? And then the widest part of your hip is where your greater trochanter is. So where those two meet, halfway along your groin, at the height of your greater trochanter, that there is your femoral head. So if you want to confirm where that is,
it might be helpful if you didn't have the slide up, but just had you in the screen.
Okay, sure, great. Thanks, Tina. I'll stop that. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. All right. So if you want to feel what it's like for your femoral head to translate forward, squeeze your butt and push your hips forward, and that femoral head will feel a little bit more round. It'll be like a ball coming forward. And then when you go back to neutral, you'll feel it sink back. So again, squeeze your butt, slide your hips forward, and feel that roundness in the front of your groin. And then relax and feel it sink back. So let's do hip flexion first. So that's around that will be your femoral head. As you squat down, that should sink back. So you can keep your fingers on your femoral head as you squat. And if you're really astute, or if you have a tight side, what you'll find is that one set of fingers doesn't sink back as far as the other one. So if you know which side you have trouble with your hip opening, you may find that, especially as you get deeper, that one side doesn't sink back as much. So yeah, so that would be a less than optimal function. Okay. If we go into extension and I turn to the side, if I step, I'm going to pay attention to my right side. So if I step forward with my left leg, and you can do that a couple of times, so you're stepping forward with the opposite leg, ideally your femoral head should still stay centered. It shouldn't poke forward, but often it does. So, and the longer you go, so if you think about warrior lunge, and you could even try warrior, if you start to feel fullness or pressure in your femoral head, you could be losing the centering. So let's go back to just standing. What if you this time think of a line from your pubic bone down to your inner knee, or this whole front of your quad. Can you keep that really long as you step forward? So think of length down your thigh as you step. And can you feel less fullness over that femoral head? And then we'll come back to sitting down when you're ready. So if someone gets pain in the front of their hip in warrior, I would do less distance between their feet, and I would be giving cues for length. And I guess being a physio, I'm lucky because I can get my hands on people and I can feel their hips. But just being aware of that, and that you're working for a centered femoral head, hopefully that will give you a few nuggets to work with. Okay. Right. So I'll take a little breath there. Does anyone have any I'm just going to scroll back, see if there's any questions relating to that. Okay. All right. I will share my screen again. Oops. Lost my spot. There we go. So hip opening is a common concept in the yoga community, but maybe we need to understand how it applies to function. The hip is designed for stability and plays a key role in load transfer. And the key structures of the hip are the acetabulum, the labrum, and the femur. And optimal function of the hip allows motion around the joint axis so the femoral head stays centered. So coming at this from a perspective that we're actually trying to optimize hip function. So it's not just a matter of flexibility. The other components are strength and control. So there's some things that I might breeze over more quickly, but we could come back to it, we could discuss it a little bit more later. And it may seem a little bit disjointed, but it's just so when we're talking about strength and control, we kind of have the same understanding of what we're talking about. So this was an interesting fact I found from the American College of Sports Medicine. Similar to other components of fitness, it's important to maintain an adequate range of motion necessary for activities of daily living. However, this increase in range of motion through training flexibility does not seem to decrease the incidence of low back pain or muscle soreness, and it has not been shown to improve athletic performance. In some cases, it has actually been shown to decrease performance. Flexibility requirements are specific to the demands of individual activities, with some activities requiring more than average range of motion at particular joints, such as gymnastics and ballet, and I would add in some yoga postures. So what it says there is basically, let's get an optimal amount of flexibility throughout the hip, and that's important. Then consider the individual demands of what that person needs to do in life. But then above that, trying to increase our flexibility further may not be the best use of our time or energy. So these are the factors that impact our flexibility. So talking about muscle properties, it's basically talking about the tissue properties. And I'll cover this briefly because I know there's like yin yoga that works on fascia. And what we're talking about with muscle properties is that body tissues and other tissues are considered to have a viscoelastic property. So viscousness means that the tissue will deform and then stay deformed. It sounds terrible, but it's basically it'll stretch and it will stay stretched. The elastic side of it means it will stretch and then it will recoil. So different tissues, like muscle is different to fascia, which is different to ligaments because they have different components. So whatever practice you use, you're trying to address the viscoelastic properties of that tissue. So fascial stretches will be held longer because you're trying to get the viscous creep where you're trying to stretch it out and keep it stretched at the end. Whereas muscles, if you're trying to stretch a muscle, 30 seconds is maximum because you're not going to get any extra benefit going over 30 seconds. So then you can design your practice around, well, I want to stretch fascia here, so I'm going to hold it longer, or I'm going to stretch muscles here and I'm going to hold it shorter. So physical activity, we've talked about how what you do throughout your day impacts, what you do throughout your lifetime impacts your hip shape, but it's through a whole body physical activity. So for example, if you, me, you, or other people, if we didn't do yoga, how many people would actually reach their arms overhead for sustained periods of time every day? Like if you're not doing down dog, you might put the washing on the line, but if you don't do yoga, you're probably not using certain aspects of your flexibility that are available. And if you don't use it, you lose it. So that's what's great about yoga, using a variety of movements that in your normal day, you probably wouldn't. Your exercise, which in terms of sports, you can be very one-sided. And I think yogis are particularly tuned into having one side different than the other. We've talked about anatomical structures. Age, you've just had more time to accumulate more injuries. As we get older, we tend to be less active, and then you've got the issues of decreased physical activity and hormonal changes that happen. And the hormonal changes also influence gender. So perhaps men and women participate in different sports throughout their lifetime. And also estrogen and progesterone increase, I guess, laxity in the joints. So that's why women, that's one of the factors why women can be more flexible than men. And also if you're measuring range actively or passively, so active is going to take the muscles into account a little bit more. I'll come back to that. So now let's move on to the kind of the complementary concept of flexibility, which is stiffness. So stiffness is the extent to which an object resists deformation. And I would say that a lot of people come to yoga and they say they want to be more flexible, but what they actually want is to feel less stiff. So being more flexible and being less stiff are actually two different things. So when people are wanting to have their hips open and flexible, perhaps they just want their hips to feel better. So let's consider that, because that'll come back later. There's some interesting research on stiffness. So because feeling stiff is associated with increased disability in multiple chronic pain conditions like back and neck arthritis. Back and neck pain, sorry, and arthritis. So lots of interventions aim to address the stiffness in order to improve functional outcomes. So we're going to leave that there, have a think of that. Then we're going to move on to strength, because there's two components to strength. So strength is a muscle's ability to generate force. And there's two components to strength. One is the number of motor units activated. So a motor unit is an individual nerve cell that supplies a few muscle fascicles. And then if you get enough motor units together, it becomes a motor pool, and it's strong enough to make the whole muscle belly contract. So one part of strength is being able to efficiently and effectively switch on enough motor units to cause a contraction. The other part of it is actually in the tissues. If you bulk up and strengthen the muscle fibers, if you get enough thickness, the muscle will become stronger. So perhaps you don't need to activate as many motor units to get the same level of force. So this applies to if you improve your strength and your or your flexibility, probably within 2 weeks of starting a practice. I would say a lot of that is coming from the motor unit side, because 2 weeks really isn't a lot of time to get tissue changes. Ultrasound studies show that it takes 4 to 6 weeks to show changes on cross-sectional area of muscle bulk. So some of the changes in strength and flexibility are going to be because of the motor units. The other part is going to be consistent practice over time. So that leads us to talk about control, which could be a whole day lecture in itself. So I have picked 4 key concepts which I think apply to flexibility. So the idea is that the body is, we can think of it as a mechanical system with lots of joints all requiring control. And we don't realize this until you suffer, or you consider people who suffer neurological disorders where they have tremors and can't control their movements. So if you were to just touch your nose, that involves your hands, your fingers, your arms, your shoulder, your trunk. You have to keep yourself upright. You have to keep your postural control. That's a lot of joints for your body to control. And if your brain had to think of every single thing, you wouldn't have the capacity to even think about breathing, or you wouldn't have the capacity to do anything else because it's so complex. So the theory is that we simplify this process by using subconscious reflexes that activate the muscles into like functional units. So I don't think about switching on my biceps. I think about all the muscles involved in, I subconsciously can move all the muscles involved in allowing that to happen. So then as we get more refined at a skill, we start to be able to use the right muscles in the right amount at the right time. So we're just refining those patterns over and over. And optimal control actually allows a large degree of movement variability. So people who are injured show less variability in their movement patterns than people who are not. And the thought is, if you're always moving in the one way, then you're going to keep stressing the same tissues over and over, and you don't get to, they don't get a rest. Whereas there's subtle changes when someone's skilled at a task, that they just do things slightly different. They don't always switch on the same muscle first. There's a little bit of variability so that some tissues are getting a rest. So that goes down to, with our yoga practice, we maybe need to consider having variability, whether or not you do one particular practice for a week, or for 4 weeks, or for 6 weeks, and you get good at it, and then maybe change it up a little bit. Or perhaps you do a different practice on Monday than you do on Friday. So considering how we can encourage some movement variability. And so this is funny because you see this picture in so many textbooks, but I've never seen, there's very few muscles. I can't even think of one that has a muscle going at right angles out from a bone. But anyway, so this is just a little bit of a representation. So you've got the muscle fiber on the far right, you group them together and you get a fascicle. And so the motor unit can supply that fascicle. So you can have tight fascicles in a muscle that's relaxed. And then if you get enough fascicles contracting, the whole muscle contracts. So we've got another little practical time of how this plays out. So let's test our wrists. So I'll stop the share again. That worked well last time. All right, so if you put your arm out, and let's test our wrist flexibility into flexion. So if you pull it down, and as far as it goes, just using your muscle activity, that is your active range. It's limited by how strong these muscles can pull, as well as how much these muscles and fascia can relax. If we want to know what the joint component is, we can add the hand, we can add a little bit of overpressure, and then you'll feel a bony, hard stop. That is the joint that's stopping you. So we've got active range, we've got passive range, which is the joint. And then if you want to feel what could be limiting that, you can let go and then just roll your hands over your forearms. I've chosen forearms because we've all got trigger point. You might be able to feel like little guitar strings, like twang, like you roll it like ropey bits. That they are hypertonic fascicles. So trigger points are thought to occur around the motor end plate where the motor unit is, and they are keeping some fascicles switched on even when you're trying not to use that muscle. So that's just an example of how what you could do is you could give yourself a treatment. You could hold some pressure on the fascicle. It'll be a little bit uncomfortable, and you can try and get your brain to get that muscle to relax. Or you could give it a fascial release, and you could do this over a couple minutes. But then what you could do is you could say, well, does my active range get better? Actually, I think mine has slightly gotten a bit further, but the passive range should stay the same. So in your yoga practice and your class design, consider there's active barriers, there's passive barriers, and then there's those, I guess there's a central nervous system component. And so different practices will influence each one. So for example, you could do a ball release on the hips. You could, and this is what I was planning to do after, you could use a trigger point ball to release some of the deep muscles of the hip. You could use a foam roller to get some of the fascia loosened up. And you can use different active practices before you try and increase the stretch, or after, or yeah, so just some ideas there. Okay, so I'm going to go back to sharing my screen again. Look, I'm not going to spend too much time on reflexes, but just the idea behind understanding reflexes, they are a key component to us into movement control. And if you stretch fast, or if you push the stretch too far, you are going to activate muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs, and you're going to be then working against central nervous system tone. So we'll come back to that here. In terms, this is what some people ask, how is the best way to improve your flexibility? So you've basically got four different ways to approach your asana practice: static, ballistic, PNF, or dynamic. So I'll talk about the reflexes where they come in. So the most common one is the static. I'll come back to this slide, I'll just go one further, because basically the idea is that you get into a position, you hold it between 15 and 30 seconds, and after you've repeated it 4 times, you will not get any extra gain in flexibility. And then if we just, I'll just go back to that previous slide. This is the best way to improve your flexibility. You'll get short-term and long-term gains. And because you're moving slowly, you're not going to activate the stretch reflex. It decreases the stiffness in the muscle tendon area, and you're using that viscoelastic property of getting a slow creep of the tissues that are able to deform and stay stretched with as little kind of rebound as possible. The thing is that because there's not movement, you're not redirecting blood flow. So there's no temperature change, and there's some evidence that increasing heat can improve the, basically, and if you've ever had honey in a jar that kind of crystallizes and then you heat it up and it goes runny again, that's the viscoelasticity improving or decreasing viscousness by using heat. In our tissues, if you heat them up, there's some evidence you can increase the stretch. Now, whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea, or maybe there's a maximum, but the idea is if you can get a little bit of heat, you will probably get better stretch. So consider in your yoga practices, do you go straight into holding stretches for a long period of time, or is there some amount of movement before you go for those deeper stretches? Because I think there should be. Also, static stretching, if you're doing a yoga practice for a sports team, you wouldn't do this before they play. They could actually increase their injury risk if you go straight into static stretching. So if anyone watches sports teams, you'll find there's a lot more dynamic movement. There's a lot less stretching going on. Okay. So just to talk about ballistic, because it's different than dynamic. So ballistic is where you're using momentum and your body weight to push yourself into the later range. So bending forward and bouncing, and it just makes me cringe just thinking of it. So it has equal benefits to static stretching, but it is by far more injurious, and it can exacerbate old injuries. It could create new ones. Even though it might increase blood flow, just don't do it. Don't go to the end of range and bounce. So, how to do it, but don't do it. And then, so we'll move on. So the PNF is the proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. The idea is that this is trying to work more on the central nervous system component. So instead of working on the tissues, you're trying to activate and use the reflex responses. and there's a few spinal reflexes, but you can either activate the muscle you're trying to stretch, or you can activate the muscle that's opposing the stretch. And again, I won't go into too much detail, but just to say that there is a risk of overstretching because you often need someone to help you. I'm going to use my elbow just because you can see it on the computer. Say you're like my dad. My dad has an elbow contracture where he can't straighten his arm. If I wanted to do PNF, I'd take it to as far as it goes, and then I can hold my hand there and say, push against me, hold, 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 and then I can get him to relax and see if I can stretch it a little bit further, and then stop there and go again. Alternatively, I could do it on the other side, say push into me here, and then see if I can still stretch it. You can do a combination. If you're working with people with neurological conditions, strokes, cerebral palsy, anything that involves spasticity, often this is a great addition because it's addressing the central nervous system component. And this one is also leading into a practical thing, so we can get up and moving, but this is, so a dynamic flexibility training, this is where sports warm-ups tend to go. And what it involves is you're moving gently through ranges of movement which activate the muscles you intend to stretch or use in the practice. It does not improve your flexibility overall as much as the static stretching, but I would say it would assist you to get better results from your static stretching. So the idea is that you're moving, you're increasing the temperature of the muscles, and you're just gradually encourage them to get that little bit more pliable as you go. So it's not ballistic. Ballistic is go to the end of range and bounce and push. This is slow, gentle, repeated. So you could think of sun salutes. Sun salutes is a really popular way to start class, and I've been playing around with it. It's really hard to not do a sun salute at the start of the class. It just doesn't, for me, it doesn't feel right to go straight into the stretch side of it, or the holding the asana. It's harder though because there's no one set way to do it. You have to think about what muscle groups you're going to use, and then you do a warm up to suit them. So I'm being suitably vague. I'm going to run you through something, a warm-up that I've been using for, so I run a class that's really for a lot of people who are injured returning to activity, or they've never done yoga before, and a lot of them had trouble bending over to touch their knees or their toes to start with. And I tried with the sun salutations, and I'm like, you know what, it's a disaster. The sun salutations is too hard. So I use this principle to think, okay, how can I warm up the muscles that we need to stretch to get them more flexible, so that then down the track, the sun salutes will be accessible to them. So if you'd like to join in, you can. Again, I'll stop the share and I'll go back to my screen. Okay. So I can't see myself. So this is based on the idea that I use this as a start of practice. I want to warm up the hips so then we can enjoy some hip stretching a little bit more. So can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Great, I got yes, great, thank you. All right, so we're going to start with our feet hip width apart, and we're going to start with a few little squats. So we're going to sit back, our hips are going back, and then coming up to standing. And we'll do a few squats here. And one thing that's good to do in this position is watch that your knees are going straight forward over your second or third toe. If we've got some hip weakness, our knees tend to come together. So we'll do 5 or so squats, and you can start to really feel that your hips are sinking back. All right, so those of you who are more comfortable staying here,
You can keep doing that, or we can make it a little bit more intense. We can squat down and we can stay there, and we can add the arms in. So inhaling arms up, exhaling arms down. And if you want to make it a little bit more intense again, you could rise up slightly and then sink back down as the arms come down. So inhale, rising up, exhale, sinking down. So hopefully you're feeling some work in through your quads, and then we can come up to standing, give the legs a little bit of a shake, and then we can take it a little one step further. We can come into our squat. We can now, so it's like Utkatasana. We'll put our weight, I'm going to mirror you, weight onto your right side. We're going to try and keep our hips level, and we're going to slide our leg out and in. So sliding your foot across the mat, and if you have your hands on your hips, you don't want to twist, you don't want to sink, and this knee needs to stay stretching over the big toe. Okay, let's come back to weight there evenly, come up to standing. Let's try it on the second side. So squatting down, transfer your weight over, and then we're going to slide the leg out. And you know what, this is my harder side because I can feel that my knee wants to come in. I have to use my hip to keep that alignment. And you can keep your hands on your hips to make sure you're not twisting. And I think ideally you'd want to be able to get 10 to 15 without any twist or hiking. I can feel myself hiking again. And then we can bring the foot down and come to standing. So hopefully we're starting to feel some heat around the hips and around the quads. We're going to now take the feet a bit wider and turn the toes out. And whenever we squat, the knees need to go over the toes. So we're going to squat down again, and we don't want the knees to come in. They need to stay over that second toe. So again, we're going to do our squats. So you can come down lower if you want to make it harder, or you can come up higher. Now, if you have pain around your hips, I would say don't turn the toes too far out. Go off to a 45, and the knees just track in line with that. So you could stay doing that, or if you want to take it up a notch, come down and then stay. Now we're not going to bounce, but we can make it harder by coming up with our inhale and easing down with the exhale. You can have your hands sliding along your thighs to help support you, or again make it harder by bringing your hands in prayer so you're not using any support. So again, if you need a break, you can come up to standing. You could go back to your neutral squats, or you can make it harder by making it isometric. So you can stay down, reach one arm up and stretch over to the side, and then coming up, go the other way, reach the other arm up and over to the side. You can even bring your hands behind in prayer, reaching the hands back, and then releasing the hands and come to standing. And then just see, hopefully you feel some warmth in those legs. And then you can have a seat back down. So what we actually did there is we used the front of our legs, we used our quads, we used the inner thigh, our adductors, we used the side of our hips, and we got them all to work. So you're welcome to have a play around with that. I actually find that I do that as my first warm up, and then I go into some sun salutes, and yeah, it's been pretty well received. So if you like it, steal it, use it, change it, have some fun. Now, what I might do is, let me just have a look, because basically I think I've covered a lot of the content that I think was important to cover. I might just open it up for a few questions. So I'm going to look in the chat box and I'll answer some questions. Okay, let me go up a bit. So the first ones that I see, so Antonio was asking, can I explain what I mean end of range?
So end of range is, I guess, as far as your joint can go. And it could be active or it could be passive. So it's just the end, as far as, so the end of range of my elbow is there, but my dad, who has his contractures from hitting too many people with elbows in his footy days, his end of range is there. I tend to say the knee should track over the second toe. The second toe is the midline of the foot. So that's why I say the kneecap over the second toe, but invariably most clients will roll in. So I've started saying even more toward the little toe side, because I think less goes wrong if the knee goes out slightly than it does if the knee comes in toward the midline. So technically, the knee should track over the second toe, but people have trouble judging that. So I get them to go a little bit wider. You know what? I'm going to go to my notebook and I'm going to answer some questions from here. So the question related to hypermobility, it is a real thing, and hopefully those I've given you some ideas about being in a more stable position and building strength or a practice around a more stable position. And pretty much that warm-up practice is a strengthening practice, and it's based on which leads into someone else's question. Gluteus medius tendinopathies are a really common occurrence, especially in women from 60 to 70 years old and onward, and it can create a lot of pain around the greater trochanter. And I would say if you tried that where people have their hips still and did their hip sliding, that sock sliding, you would find a lot of people wobbling around. So I think have a try with that little warm up and see if that helps. Now, Louise asked about the side of the hip, glute med and TFL. Maybe if I can get Louise to unmute if you're still here, so you can clarify that.
Sometimes I feel to the side, just near where the underpants are, sometimes a tiny little flick, almost like a hat elastic flick, and the fibers on that. So here.
Mm-hmm. And what's your question related to that? Like, what's it from, or what to do about it?
What to do about it, and how to stop it from happening, strengthening the area so it stops it from happening.
Yeah, good question. Like snapping hip or clicking hips are hard. What I'd say is you try and balance the forces around the hip. And the point I was going to talk about is if you are constantly releasing one muscle group over and over, like it should only take a couple of weeks to release. So if it's not releasing, or if it's muscle tissue stiff tightness, 4 weeks maximum. So if 2 years in you're still releasing a muscle group, I would actually be looking at control. And so we will actually, there's a section of the lecture ahead that I'll go through in a second. Basically, we need to think of layers of control. So instead of just the direction that the muscles are, front of the hip, back of the hip, we need to think if it's deep, middle, or superficial. And you can design your cues and your practices related to trying to affect something in each layer. So the deeper system, and this made me think of Tina's lecture regarding chakras. I think some of the value of using chakras in a yoga practice is that really helps you connect with the deep system of muscles, because Tina, and she might be able to elaborate a bit more, but what I took out of it is that chakras become a point of focus for meditation and able to be able to connect into that area. And so the stability muscles of your hip are really closely related to the root chakra. So using some type of cues related to the pelvic floor and chakras in that area could help wake up the deep system. And perhaps if we work on that, then it can help. And also looking at what's happening on the opposite side of the hip. So if it's tight on the outside, is that trying to balance excessive pulls on the inside? So I'd be looking at people's ability to get their knees wide, like Supta Baddha Konasana, and go, well, maybe there's some trigger point releases or some stretches they could do in that direction, which will then stop the hip having to feel like it's pulling outwards.
Thank you.
And Tina, do you have I haven't bastardized your talk on the chakras? Is there anything that you'd want to add about using chakras during a practice, or?
That was an interesting take on it, actually, Emily, because the way that Maureen and I were talking about the chakras was definitely as an energetic system, not really relating it into the muscular or skeletal, or in fact the body rather than the energy body, because it's part of the energy body system. But the way you took out of that, if we do place our attention into a particular chakra, it does in fact, I admit, sensitize you to the deeper levels. So I think physiologically it could be useful that way. So you taught me something there about chakras.
Oh, and I said it wrong again. I told you in your...
I was saying, you weren't listening very well there, Emily.
I took the concept at least. Oh dear.
That was about whether you say chakra or chakra. Chakra.
Chakra, yes. Okay, so now there's a couple questions here about the best postures for hip opening. I've talked about how long to hold it for. Talked a bit about hip replacements. So hip replacements, you do not want to combine flexion, adduction, and internal rotation. So crossing your legs is a no-no, as is bending forward past 90 degrees. So not past 90 degrees. So using blocks and chairs to try and not get into those levels, simply because when they open the hip up, they come in posteriorly, and that's where the capsule remains more vulnerable. Joint versus muscle flexibility. Hopefully I've talked about that. Sorry, I didn't have time to write down the name of everyone who put a question in. I was busy getting the questions down. So the person who asked about joint and muscle flexibility, if you could unmute yourself and let me know if I have talked about that enough, because I do have more content later. Okay. All right, so I recognise that I've taken up a bit of time, so I won't be offended if anyone needed to leave, but I think in order to fully cover the idea of hip opening, we will press on. Is that okay? All right, so I'm going to share my screen again, I think. Let me have a try. Okay. So just to summarize where we've gotten to, flexibility is just one aspect of hip function, and there's other components to consider are strength and stiffness. And stiffness might be in the tissues, but it's also modulated by the central nervous system. So you can impact flexibility with specific flexibility training techniques and implementing those theories into your practice. So we'll talk a bit more about control. So this is what I was talking about in terms of 3 layers of control, and this you can apply throughout the whole body. And so we talked about, for the hip, it's a really nice illustration that you need the center of axis, center of motion to stay centered and not slide around. So the muscles closest and deepest to the joint are going to provide that function. They have a postural support role. They're switched on a little bit all the time. They support the joint complex and really kind of hold it in. So in our shoulder, the rotator cuff does that job. In our pelvis and our lumbar spine, that's transversus abdominis and our pelvic floor. So we have deep systems, and I like to think of it as core muscles throughout our body. Then we have an intermediate system, and there's questions about piriformis and psoas, and they fit in this intermediate system. So they have some control function, and also what's interesting is one muscle can have multiple actions. So psoas, for example, the deepest fibers seem to act on a stability component in the lumbar spine, but the more superficial fibers act as hip flexors. And so the intermediate system has some control function, but it's capable of producing more torque, more rotation, and more power. And the superficial system is the furthest away from the joint complex. The muscles are larger and thicker. They're usually a different type of muscle fiber, which is designed to switch on, do a job, and switch off, less postural. And they're important for power and torque production. So if we look at the stabilizers of the hip, if you want any great resources, look for Dr. Alison Grimaldi. She's a physio with a PhD up in Queensland. She has lots of blog resources, and there's like a resources list at the end of this, and I've listed that down. But she's got some great resources, and she's done a lot of the research on hips. So these are your stabilizers: quad fem, glute med, gemelli, obturators, iliocapsularis, which I didn't even know was a muscle. So I'm guessing it goes from the ilia to the capsule of the hip, and the deep fibers of psoas. Okay, so while we're here, if you were trying to activate these muscles, you would be thinking of cues that help the body, help the student or yourself to draw the hip bone into the socket. So this is why I guess why I had that take home message or that thought from Tina and the chakras, because when you're activating your deep system, you won't see a movement. It's not really obvious, but you'll feel a difference. So, so it's that sense of pulling, letting your thigh bones sink into your pelvis. So this is what I get people to do when they're on their back. So lying in the back, knees bent, and thinking of the thigh bones sinking deeper into their pelvis before they initiate a leg lift. That would be an example of trying to switch on the hip muscles. The stability muscles. Also, interestingly, there are fascial connections from your pelvic floor through the obturators into the outer hip. So using pelvic floor contractions, so stopping yourself doing a wee, drawing the pubic bone toward the tailbone, things like that, that's going to activate your pelvic floor, can potentially have a stabilizing impact on the hip. And some of my clients, I need to start with pelvic floor and those type of cues so that they can build up this strength and then tolerate harder exercises. So then we'll go to the intermediate level. This is your piriformis and your psoas, and glute med, which is it's the key player. When it's weak, it's the key player in gluteal tendinopathies. So that activity we did when you went to a squat and you moved one leg out, the stabilizing leg relies on glute med doing a consistent isometric contraction. So if when you're sliding your leg out, your knees wobbling, your hips are going up and down or twisting, that would be a sign potentially of glute med being a little bit weak. Yeah, and so if you've got questions about psoas, piriformis, they're all kind of in that same layer, which is interesting. I think in the yoga community, maybe glute med is a little bit underappreciated. It was by me, not just in yoga community. I didn't really think of it so much. And then this is what takes our focus, the superficial muscles. So that's your glutes, your TFL, your adductors, rec fem, sartorius, hamstrings. So what I would say is, in a yoga practice, maybe consider, if you're trying to improve your flexibility or even your strength, could you do something to think 3D of the hip and think of doing something in each zone. So the other thing about these superficial muscles is they control pelvis on hip motion. So the hip doesn't just function under the pelvis. When the leg is fixed, these muscles will control pelvic tilts. They'll help you get from a forward bend back up to standing, and walking and running. So controlling pelvis on hip motion. And then we could think about it. So Dr. Grimaldi talked about then muscle synergies. So instead of just thinking of hip flexors and hip extensors, the muscles of flexion can be superficial, they can be intermediate, and they could be deep. So I'm not going to read out what they are. I've put them in the handout just so you've got an idea of what's in what system. But the abductor synergy is really interesting, because what I didn't talk about before we looked at the compartments is because there is no abductor compartment of the thigh. So that involves upper glute max and your TFL and your lateral quad. They're all in the lateral system. Oops. And then you've got glute med and piriformis in the intermediate system and glute min in the deep system. So if you're always having to release TFL or your lateral quads, maybe consider, is there some strength that you could do for glute med, or maybe release for piriformis, or maybe strengthening for piriformis, and glute min. So I'm just going to go over these. So that was the idea of just making you aware of the idea of muscle synergies. So key points to take away is, I think yoga is really beneficial because it does work in functional patterns which activates these synergies. But we need to take a broader perspective than just releasing or focusing on one muscle, and optimizing control of the hip. So we did those control exercises. So optimizing control is an effective way of improving hip function. So consider your cues or your techniques that might work at different layers, and 3D around the hip. So there's been a couple questions around hip stiffness and some tests. So this is where we're getting a little bit more, you've gone through kind of the theory, and now you can kind of understand how it applies. So with the hip and posture, what's really interesting is if someone has their posture aligned well, and this plumb line, this straight line kind of shows where the line of gravity should fall, it means that the center of axis is just actually posterior, just behind the hip joint. So what that means is standing requires very little muscle activity if your posture is good and erect, because just the alignment of gravity will hold you into extension. If you happen to have a bit of a slouch posture, or people might lock their knees back, so they hyperextend their knees and their pelvis goes forward, and then so you get this kind of zigzag alignment, that actually becomes less efficient. So optimal posture allows better hip function because it's more energy efficient. And what I've included is some ideas about hip tests, because so in physio, if we want to work out what is going on in someone's hip, we'll take their story, we'll consider imaging, and then there's a battery of tests we'd put them through to work out, is it the joint, is it the ligaments, is it the muscles? And I don't expect you guys to become physios by the end of one lecture, but what I wanted to point out is sometimes, and I think this has been a question, judging by your questions, is kind of how do you know when it's muscle, and how do you know when it's joint, and what do you tell people depending on what they feel? Like, how can I make that assumption, or give them some tips? Is that fair to kind of make that statement? Maybe? Okay, so what I'll go through is a couple tests, because the sensation elicited can kind of give you an idea of what to expect from it. The idea is a positive test is if you get a sharp, pinching, deep pain, or you get any change of sensation. That would be a positive joint kind of test. So I would say in an asana practice, you shouldn't get sharp, shooting, aching kind of pains. That's not good. What you should feel is kind of a stretch. And it should be kind of in more the line of pull of a muscle, and it's allowed to feel effortful, and it should be relatively superficial, I'd say. All right. So if you wanted to try this, you can. I won't do it for the sake of time. I'll just talk you through it. But the test on the left is called the quadrant test, and that's where we lie someone on their back. You pull your knee in toward your chest, or you have someone do that for you, and then you keep it pulled into your chest while you move the knee from the inside to the outside and back in again. And what that does is essentially grind the hip joint surfaces together. So if someone's doing a posture which would be similar, I would say Pavana Muktasana would be similar. If you're feeling pain in the front of your hip, or if the joint itself feels jammed up or sore, that's not what you want to feel for that asana. That would be a joint sensation. So I would be getting you to have your knee at an angle that is most comfortable and not to elicit anything over the front of the hip. Another test is called the Faber test, which is flexion, abduction, and external rotation. And there was a question related to the SI joint. So it's kind of like a one-legged Supta Baddha Konasana. And it's usually, you can do it pretty passively by putting your foot on your opposite knee. So it does stress the hip, but it's also going to stretch the psoas. It's going to stress the pelvis, especially the SI joint and the lumbar spine. So I guess the take-home message is some postures, as simple as they may seem, like Supta Baddha Konasana, it is going to stretch multiple things. So if you're trying to work through this posture and you're not getting increase in flexibility, I would consider maybe there's some dysfunction around the lumbar spine or the pelvis, which your hip is compensating for, and maybe some treatment or a different approach, or doing something about control of the hip, or maybe having to look at something going on elsewhere, might then unlock the flexibility in the hip that you've been after. So simply repeating a yoga posture may not be the best path forward. And this is what I found really interesting, so this is to follow on what we talked about with stiffness at the start. So most interventions are based on a belief that stiffness is reflecting the actual biological state of the tissues. But what's been found is these interventions are not really improving people's levels of disability. It just hasn't been effective. And sensations of low back stiffness, they've done a series of these guys, Stanton, Wolseley, Wong, and Korchak, have done a series of experiments that show that stiffness is largely perceptual and protective in nature, rather than reflecting the actual biomechanical and tissue changes. So if you were to do these last two tests, the Faber and the quadrant, and you're like, I've got full range, no problems, but I feel stiff, or your stiffness changes throughout the day, or your stiffness changes in response to whatever activities you've been doing in the last 24 hours or the last week, I would say potentially your stiffness is protective in nature rather than actually in the tissues. So I would be designing practices based on improving control and strength rather than trying to keep improving that sensation of stiffness. So that's what I was talking about there. I jumped ahead. I think I just repeated my slide there. So, and the point of this slide is that this is what we know from the pain sciences research, that pain is actually largely a construct or experience from wide regions of the brain. And so stiffness is may be thought to be similar to pain. We actually don't have pain receptors. We've got receptors for chemical changes and pressure and heat and cold. We don't have pain receptors. The experience of pain is produced within the brain and the central nervous system. So stiffness may be in the same category. So just a summary of what we've gone over there. So stiffness is associated with disability and pain. Sometimes it's in the tissues, but sometimes it's mediated from our central nervous system. So just improving range doesn't necessarily result in reductions of disability, but if we can improve someone's ease of movement, they'll be able to do the things they love. And I think their hips would feel more open if they can move them more easily. So this is just to wrap it all up together in the context of hip opening. Our approach to flexibility. So maybe collectively, this is something that we could all consider, and I welcome any emails or discussion. How much emphasis do we put on flexibility, individually and collectively? And perhaps we don't mean to, but if we are focusing on the end form, rather than the sensations or the qualities of movement, perhaps we are inadvertently contributing to that idea that yoga is about flexibility and that people are trying to get more flexible. This is just thoughts that have philosophically come up while I'm really considering this idea of hip opening. And Judith Lassiter had this quote, there are only two asanas, conscious or unconscious. In other words, what distinguishes a particular position as an asana is our focus, not simply the outer conformation of the body. And I think a lot of us would go, yeah, I agree with that. But the hard part is then how do we do that in our yoga classes? I don't have the answer. So now let's just go back to where we started about traditional hip opening, and let's break it down. So traditional hip opening is a static stretch. It's the end of range, but also consider that it's not just the muscles that are going to be stressed at the end of range. You've got the joint capsule, you've got increased joint compression, and you've got ligaments that are going to be affected at the end of range. So from your experience, and feel free to put this in the chat box so we can discuss it after if you like, how do you go with the traditional hip opening postures? What's been the experience of your students? And is this approach effective? So while you have a think of that, you might have something to add. I went on to good old yoga journal, put in hip opening poses, and this is what I came up with because I wanted to see what we were all thinking of in terms of hip opening. So you can have a look and think, yeah, or not, think there, and then the other page, it goes on. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that, but when I just dissect it, basically in one or multiple planes, they're taking the hip to the end of range of motion. And if I look through these postures, some of them I can't do, and there's no way that some of my clients could even start to do. You know, the clients and the students who go, my hips are really stiff, I want open hips, there's no way that I could get them to do, they can't, some of them can't even do easy pose Sukhasana. So child's pose is probably the only one on that list that they could do. Maybe Supta Baddha Konasana also. But the problem with hip opening is you require really flexible hips to start. And if you have stiff, tight hips, you can't do them unless you force yourself to do them, and then you're at chance of injury or aggravation. And they don't take into account the multi-factors that we've learned about today as to why your hips could feel stiff. So I think we should reframe hip opening to de-emphasize range of motion. We should be looking for lightness and ease, strength and control as well. And think about it 3D instead of really zoning in on just one muscle. And consider the layers and synergies as well. So here's just some ideas of maybe using some cues to drawing attention to a stretch. or you may need to reach or lift or engage or soften in order to feel, and focus on the sensations and the ease rather than the end of range. Sorry, the sun has just come out. So what I did throughout today's presentation is we've actually covered a lot of the practical that I wanted to. There's so much more we could do, and there's other practical sessions we could do, but we have run out of time. So I'll just breeze through here because these were just literally slides of the types of things that we could go through, and we've actually covered most of those except the large practical at the end. So that's the presentation on yoga and the hips. If you'd like to connect with me, you'll now have you'll have that email from me with the handout for today. Physio Yoga Strath is where I practice as a physio. Emily Iglesias is my page dedicated to more yoga education, and we've got some references there. So I'm gonna stop share, and oh my goodness, it is bright. I might just have to move for a second.
Now we can see you.
So I'm just looking through the questions. So does anyone, hopefully, I think if I open up my little notebook again, I feel like I've covered most of the questions, but I'll throw it over. If you wanted to unmute yourself and ask any questions, feel free to do so.
I got a question which I have put in the chat, Emily. What is the role of synovial fluids and enabling that to sort of flow in removing the stiffness? Yeah,
good question. Related to the synovial fluid, I have limited understanding, but this is what I do know. Synovial fluid has a role in nourishing the health of the joint, especially because cartilage has poor blood flow. So joint health is reliant on fluid. When you have excess fluid or irritation within the joint, then the joint becomes painful. So an inflamed joint, so if someone has a systemic arthritis, so rheumatoid arthritis or other inflammatory joint conditions, the joint surfaces might become painful, and I wonder if you have excessive fluid, that could be a source of pain as well. So I think I digress a little bit. So in terms of synovial fluid itself, the idea is that you want to use gentle range of motion, and then that can help spread the fluid across the joint. In terms of practices that help that, I'm not really sure. I know Donna Farry uses like all fours, like on all fours, circling the hips around to move the synovial fluid. I don't know any more about that. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I mean, gentle warming certainly helps. For example, when I get up in the morning, certainly I feel stiffness in the lower back. Just simple movement of hip, no stretching, certainly removes the stiffness almost instantaneously. So I'm trying to understand what is happening there. So
I would actually hazard a guess that it has less to do with synovial fluid and maybe more to do with the control and the central nervous system mediated stiffness.
Okay.
So, and then that's getting into another, so if you came in, I'd be looking at your whole body function and how your pelvis is functioning, how your hip is functioning, because that's stiffness in the morning that goes away really quickly. If it's, there can be some level of inflammation that does that, but I would start to question the stiffness related to function, optimal lumbopelvic hip function.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Okay, who we got here?
Hi, Emily. It's Pincer here from Sydney.
Hi, Pincer.
Hi, question. So continuing from I asked you about hypermobility, So because of the hypermobility, it then causes my glutes to tighten a lot. So do you have any suggestions to balance that interaction between hypermobile hips and then the tightening of the glutes?
Good question. Because my first thing I'd want to do is to probably, my physio brain would like to see an x-ray to go, well, how much of this is the joint and how much of it is it, do you think it's overtraining, or do you think you were born with that?
I've also got scoliosis because I've got congenital emphysema, so that probably also comes into play too as well.
Yeah, so what I would be looking at, I'll just move this back, is, like I said, those postures being starting here.
Yep.
This is the most stable position here and here. And you can do things like trying to get hip extension without spine extension. You probably can't see with the dark background.
Okay.
So things like working into hip extension this way. Also, that warm-up sequence we did where you're having to control your hips. So I'd be working a lot on hip control, and because my experience with people is if they don't have a really strong or coordinated deep system, the superficial system kicks in and keeps tightening up. So with any of my clients, if I have to keep releasing the same superficial muscles, I start questioning, well, maybe we need to do some Pilates or some stability type exercises, and then see if the muscles stay released or if they just let go. Okay.
Thank you, Emily.
That's all right. So Angela Matteo asked, what can I say about pigeon pose? Can you elaborate on that? So I said Angela, so Alicia Matteo, sorry. What can I say about pigeon pose? Not sure what's the question about pigeon pose.
Sorry, my question is about, so many people say this is a posture like it's very aggressive for the hips or the knees. And then you reckon it's a posture that we should try to find a way to keep. Sometimes we change the way that we approach the posture, especially for the knee issues. But in terms of hips issues,
I do think it's a very end of range position. So if we think about it, if I move this down again so you can see. So if I'm doing pigeon this way, my hip has to go into full extension. If we consider the normative values, our hip, when our knee is extended, we can get about 30 degrees, or we should about 30 degrees of hip extension. If you bend the knee, you only get 10 degrees. So then if you are here and then you're pushing your hips down, I'll come back. And especially if you're adding knee flexion in and you're upright, like that's really going to force your hip onto the front of your labrum. So, and then on the other side, this hip is in full external rotation, abduction and flexion. So I guess my thought would be that the back hip is at more risk of being stressed than the front one. The front one's more toward a stable position than the back one. And some of us really like pigeon pose, so I don't think you have to take it out, but I don't think it's the be all and end all. And sometimes I use pigeon pose as a way for people to test their progression. So we might do pigeon pose at the start, then they might do some foam rolling, some ball releases, some stability things, and then we could go back at the end of the session or after a couple of weeks and we could use pigeon pose as a test. So I would see pigeon pose as a test. If you like it, do it. But if you have trouble with it, find other things you can do to balance hip motion and control and see if your pigeon improves. Because if doing it over and over isn't working, then Einstein would say that you're insane.
Thank you. Thanks.
That's all right. Lynette says this masterclass on hips has completely changed our understanding of flexibility through knowing more on hip anatomy. Fantastic. Just Oh, sorry, I've gone back to the start. I'm just, feel free to call out. I'm just going to scan through to see if I've missed questions.
Emily, I was just wondering,
Yes.
you said something about motor units,
Yes.
and I just wondered if you could explain that a little bit more. I even forget the context now, but...
Sure. So a motor unit is where a nerve cell comes in and supplies a muscle. I'll see if I can bring up a picture of it, because I talk with my hands and I'm limited. So what if I share my screen? There we go. Hopefully you can see that. I'll start talking. So one nerve cell comes in and it attaches into all these little kind of fascicles or fibers. So the fibrils are the tiniest part of the muscle, and then one of them makes up a muscle fiber. And so this motor unit is made up of a bunch of muscle fibers, and they do think that trigger points start where there's some dysfunction, or this stays, the channels stay open, and the motor unit tells this muscle fiber or fascicle to keep contracting. The idea is you could, if you feel ropey bands in muscles, you could try some trigger point releases to try and reduce the tone and tension from the nervous system. So a motor unit, if just one is active, you'll get like a ropey band. If you get enough motor units firing, the whole muscle will contract. And then if you're training a task and getting better and better at it, you're actually going to be more selective in the motor units that you recruit. So you're refining, you're using a finer number of motor units. Does that?
So is that the same as if you did visualization of a movement, you're encouraging those motor units to fire?
I think so. I couldn't tell you in much more detail, but I think that's how visualization can be really helpful, because the motor units obviously supply a muscle, but they have connections to the central nervous system. So you're actually getting the motor patterns from the central nervous system firing up and probably refining it through the patterning in your brain rather than peripherally into the tissues.
Thank you for that.
Great, you're welcome. Any other questions?
I think people are starting to have to leave, Emily,
Yes.
and leaving charming messages as they do so. But perhaps that's a cue that we've reached our time, even though we can always continue to learn from you. This is, I think, the third presentation that we've had you do for us, and it's always a wonderful presentation with lots of take-homes and lots to think about, continue mulling over for such a long time. And it really works so well in this format too, I thought, with the slideshow and and the interaction and the little exercise demos, and I just think it's been utterly fabulous. So I've written a couple of little take-homes here. I thought, oh, look for lightness and ease. Of course, we'll look for lightness and ease. Why should we do anything else? What is it about? It's not about pain and stress and pushing and the ego wanting us to, or someone else's ego wanting us to go further and further. That's even worse, perhaps. And also to go for the 3D. That's been really enlightening to me, is to actually think about those different layers, the synergies between muscles. So I'll be going back over your presentation to try and get that more again. So thank you, Emily. That's been fantastic. Sure. I think we should do an online applause. And,
Oh, wonderful.
Those who've got their videos on. And there has been a couple of little things I've noticed in the chat window about will the presentation be available. Yoga Australia have actually asked us to make sure that it's recorded, so I'm guessing that they're going to come up with some way of sharing it, but I will talk to Georgia about that tomorrow to see what plans they can come in place, how they might share it. So stay tuned, and we'll try and make it available to you to watch again and again and again and again until we're as knowledgeable as Emily, which will never be. Thank you again, Emily, and thank you everyone who's been present and you're still present. It's been a really wonderful way for us to have our state meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you, Tina.
Yeah. So maybe we